Hello, ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Vanderpool, and today we're going to move on to the concept of federalism, one of the most important concepts in AP government. So the concept of federalism answers many questions regarding state versus federal powers. So it might answer the questions like questions regarding disaster relief. So for example, 2005 you had Hurricane Katrina. Whose job was it to clean up New Orleans and the rest of the coast after Hurricane Katrina? Was it the federal government's job? Was it the state's government's job? In this case, the state of New Orleans. No Child Left Behind. That piece of legislation was a piece of legislation where the federal government was stepping in to increase and regulate school performance. But should the national government, should the federal government step in to regulate school performance? That is the question. So now let's talk a little bit more about federalism. So what is federalism? Federalism is two or more governments exercising power and authority over the same people in the same territory, or the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. This idea of federalism was talked about in Federalist number 51. And the Federalist number 51 defends the Constitution. It explains why strong government is necessary. One of the famous quotes from Federalist 51 is, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." And it defends the division of powers between the state and national government. States have some powers, and the federal government has powers under the concept of federalism. So let's take a look at some of these powers. Now there's very specific types of powers that you need to know. You've got delegated powers. These are also called enumerated powers. These are powers given to the federal government by the Constitution. And much of these are found in Article 1, Section 8, that talk about the powers of Congress. So some of these powers are to coin money, to declare war, etc. If you look in Article 1, Section 8, you'll find a lot of delegated powers, and Article 1, Section 8 is going to be talking about the delegated powers of Congress. These are powers that are given to the federal government by the Constitution. Then you have the reserved powers. These are powers that only states have. Okay, these are given by the 10th Amendment. Okay, so basically what it comes down to is all powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. So if a power, governmental power is not given to the federal government, then the 10th Amendment will give it to the states. Then you have some powers like concurrent powers. These are powers that are shared. Then you'd have prohibited powers that are denied from both the state government and the federal government. So for example, neither states nor the federal government can tax exports. Now, the powers of the federal government have expanded greatly over the years due to something called the Elastic Clause in the U.S. Constitution. This is also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 says, "The Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof." So basically the idea behind this is it's impossible to predict all the powers that Congress will need to function. And so sometimes we might need to allow Congress extra powers to fulfill their delegated powers. Now, these extra powers necessary to fulfill their delegated powers are called implied powers. So basically what this is saying is Congress can make laws that are necessary and proper in order to be able to execute its delegated powers. And these powers are called implied powers. Now, the idea of implied powers was established in a groundbreaking Supreme Court case called McCulloch versus Maryland. So here's the background. The Bank of the United States was a national bank operated in Maryland. Maryland did not want the Bank of the United States to operate in the state. They felt the competition was unwarranted. It was unwanted and unfair. So Maryland taxed the bank to put it out of business. McCulloch, who was a Bank of the United States employee, refused to pay that state tax. So basically what was happening here is the constitutionality of whether you can have a Bank of the United States, whether you could have a national bank, was being challenged. So, is a Bank of the United States constitutional? This was the question addressed in McCulloch versus Maryland. And ultimately, John Marshall, under the Marshall Court, answered yes. So the national government has certain implied powers that go beyond delegated powers. The United States needs a national bank for borrowing, lending, holding minted money, etc., all of which are delegated powers. So, according to McCulloch versus Maryland, the ability to set up a national bank is an implied power based on the delegated powers that were given to the Congress to borrow and to coin money. Now, another question that was addressed in McCulloch is, can a state tax the federal government? And the answer was no. The federal government is supreme according to John Marshall here. Since the Bank of the United States is constitutional, only the feds may tax it. So here, John Marshall was reaffirming the Supremacy Clause and the Elastic Clause. So the Supremacy Clause basically comes from Article 6(2), in which the Constitution is declared to be the supreme law of the land. Now, another clause that is often used to expand federal power is what's called the Commerce Clause, okay? And both the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause made the national federal government get stronger. So let's take a look at the Commerce Clause. So this comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. The Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So here, Congress has used the Elastic Clause to stretch this power. So what is commerce? Buying and selling of goods and services. So Congress is given the power to regulate commerce between foreign countries and the United States as well as state to state. Basically, they control business law. Now, a big case regarding the Commerce Clause was Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. This is also called the Steamboat Case. Ogden received a state license monopoly to run a ferry across the Hudson. Gibbons also saw the potential of the traffic between New Jersey and New York and obtained a federal license. Ogden sued, saying that he had a valid state license even though Gibbons had the U.S. license. The result of this case is Gibbons won. This expanded national power in all areas of commerce law because the nation overruled state in interstate trade issues. So the federal government got stronger, and all trade today is primarily controlled by national law. So commerce is therefore really, when broadly defined, like in Gibbons, covers almost any type of commercial activity. So who cares about this? Why is it important? Gibbons versus Ogden, the ruling, makes a loophole. It gives Congress the power to take control of any issue involving the movement or of people or things, greatly increasing the ability of the federal government to act in accordance with its delegated powers. So let's look at a couple other cases here regarding the Commerce Clause. You had U.S. versus Lopez, 1995. 1995, you had gun-free school zone law, banned possession of a firearm within 1,000 feet of a school. The 12-year-old Lopez carried a gun onto the property. Now, Lopez declared this law unconstitutional, saying it had nothing to do with commerce. Carrying a weapon through a school zone is too much of a stretch for commerce. And this limited national government power. So the question here is, carrying a gun defined as commerce? And ultimately, it was decided that it was not. And so therefore, the federal government's ability to regulate carrying a gun is not protected by the Commerce Clause. Okay. Now you also have Gonzalez versus Reich here, 2005. This was based on the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. The government regulates the manufacture, importation, possession, and distribution of certain drugs. Medical marijuana legalized in California, but illegal to the U.S. government. Reich argued the Commerce Clause should not take effect because there was no business transaction and there were no state border issues, so therefore the federal government does not have the power to regulate it. The Supreme Court ruled 63 against Reich here, saying that the federal government could trump state laws that permitted medical marijuana. So now there's a couple of different types of federalism here. Old school is dual federalism. Federal and state governments remain dominant in their spheres of influence. Gibbons versus Ogden proved life is not that simple. New school is what's called cooperative federalism. State and federal governments work together to solve complex problems. So a couple of metaphors here. Dual federalism is also known as layer cake federalism, where the federal government and the state, they operate in their separate spheres of influence. Then cooperative federalism is also known as marble cake, where the state and the federal governments, their powers are all intermixed.